Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 408. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Very well. Happy to have you back on. A lot to go through on today's show. Just want to remind people they can share the show from the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey is where we post the video version of the show. Although both on the Institute page and on the anti-war page, we do just embed the video there if you want to watch it from that site. And then you can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. And Connor, with that, we should get into today's show. The first article that I have up today is some good news, actually. House Democrats urge Biden to drop charges against Julian Assange. A group of House Democrats sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland urging the Biden administration to drop charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is facing up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes if indicted to the U.S. and convicted. The letter was led by Representative Rashida Tlaib and also signed by Representative AOC, Ilhan Omar, Representative Presley, Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, and Greg Cesar. I guess these are all members of the squad, except this last guy is just a Democrat, but they're all Democrats. Disappointing not to see any Republicans signed on to this letter, but it's good that Assange is getting some attention in Congress. Of course, Connor, this week we had the major, I don't want to say milestone, but anniversary. Assange has now been in the Belmarsh prison in the UK for 4 years. Our friend Misty Winston led an event at the Department of Justice on the 11th to protest and demand that the Biden administration drop charges against Assange. Of course, we're not seeing that yet, but at the same time, it's good to see these movements and momentum building. We also have Assange's, I believe his brother and father are touring around the country doing whatever they can to try to raise awareness and to get more people ready to help out. Now, Connor, for today's show, I had a lot of stories I was going to talk about dealing with these leaked documents that are appearing online. I'm actually going to save this for Monday because we just had a major event happen in that story, which is the arrest of a 21-year-old airman. He, I believe, a member of the Air National Guard. The guy was actually living in a town not too far from where I live, so I wonder if I head over that way tomorrow, if I'll see anything or find anything out. I might just take probably like a half hour and take a drive down there, just see what happens and if anything's going on, and if anybody has anything to say that I can maybe bring some interesting analysis to this. But so with his arrest, I want to take the weekend to try to find out more about the leaker. I think as all the listeners of the show, anybody who's listened will have noticed, we've been very skeptical about the leaks, why they're coming out. Is the documents potentially altered? We've had, at least one piece of information, the casualty counts, the White House claims that those were altered. And then just other things that seem kind of odd to me, Connor, like we had the documents admitting that we're spying on the South Korean leader, but at the same time, South Korea is also agreeing to send 500,000 artillery rounds to Ukraine. And you would think that South Korea might be a little upset over the fact that their leader is being spied on by the U.S., but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I have a lot of questions about these documents. I'm hoping as we learn more about the potential leaker, then we could understand more of the motivations. And look, I want to be very careful too to not just say that this guy is guilty, because essentially, from my understanding, he was identified first by the Washington Post and the New York Times, and then the government arrested him. Now, this morning, the Biden administration was saying that they were very close to making an arrest, but according to the Washington Post, he was posting these documents on Discord and just a channel. So, I mean, this story is truly astounding, Connor, and I'm going to have a lot to say about it next week, but rather than just reacting and then having to go and correct myself a bunch, I do want to just take the weekend and I'll have a heavy show on the documents come Monday. Now, some other news that I do want to talk about here. Seymour Hersh, the CIA knows Ukrainian officials are skimming USaid. On Wednesday, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a report on Substack that alleged the CIA was aware of widespread corruption in Ukraine and the embezzlement of USaid. The report said that the Ukrainian government has been using U.S. taxpayer money to purchase diesel from Russia to fuel its military. Hersh said Zelensky has been buying the fuel from Russia, the country which it and Washington are at war, and the Ukrainian president and many in his entourage believe that they have been skimming untold millions from American dollars earmarked for diesel fuel payments. Hersh said, according to one estimate by the CIA, at least $400 million in funds were embezzled last year. Sources told Hersh that Ukrainian officials were also competing to set up front companies for export contracts to private arms dealers around the world. And Connor, this story could be big if it gains any mainstream media attraction, as we've really wanted some kind of oversight when it comes to the over $100 billion now that Congress has authorized to send to Kiev over the past year. And while it doesn't seem there's really any political momentum for that up until this point, maybe this will be kind of the straw that breaks that camel's back, and we could finally get a special investigative general, somebody who hopefully is actually going to do their job and look at where this money is going and how it's being spent, and give that information to the American people. Because without it, Connor, I'm guessing that the Hersh article may be like short of zero on how much of this money is truly being stolen. So, this is pretty interesting. Now I want to move on and bring up this one. I think it's a kind of a follow-up to something I wrote last week to the Libertarian Institute. I think this was actually my antiwar.com article last week, where I pointed out that the U.S. was looking to send some officials to Europe and demand that they crack down on any businesses that were still engaging economically with Russia, or they would face sanctions. And now the U.S. has slapped sanctions on a Hungarian bank over its ties to Russia. And this happened on Wednesday. According to Reuters, the sanctions targeted the top three officials in the International Investment Bank in Budapest, 2 Russian nationals and 1 Hungarian national. U.S. Ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, said the U.S. had previously warned Hungary about the bank. And I also saw a statement on Twitter by Antony Blinken, I believe. It was a top U.S. official basically saying that we're really going to come down on the sanctions and try to get these enforced more broadly. So, Connor, it does look like they are willing to come down on Europe. Now, it's interesting that Hungary is being targeted first, as it is one of the least enthusiastic countries about the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, one of the last NATO member states to approve Finland joining the alliance. Next up, an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute this time. Senator Joe Manchin travels to Ukraine, calls for defeat of Putin. A group of 3 influential senators traveled to Kiev and met with President Zelensky. The lawmakers, accompanied by country music singer Brad Paisley, called for the defeat of Russian President Vladimir Putin and pledged more weapons for Ukraine. The 3 senators are Joe Manchin, Lisa Murkowski, and Mark Kelly, met with Zelensky on Wednesday. In a press release from his office, Manchin called for Putin to be defeated without providing a clear meaning of what that entails. After the visit, I am even more convinced that defeating Vladimir Putin and ending his ruthless war against the Ukrainian people must remain our top priority, he said. Senator Murkowski claimed that the visit inspired her to send more military aid to Ukraine. The senator explained, "As I return home, I'm more thankful than ever for the blessings of our American democracy. I'm more committed than ever to ensuring that our Congress provides the assistance that Ukraine needs." In his statement, Kelly echoed both of his colleagues. "For the sake of democracy, freedom, and our vital national security interests, Putin must lose this war." He continued, "We must do more, and when I return to the Senate, I will continue working with my colleagues and our military leaders to get Ukraine the weapons and support it needs to win." Zelensky asked the American lawmakers to remove restrictions on weapons it supplies Kiev. In a statement from his office, the Ukrainian president has been pressing NATO countries to provide Kiev with weapons, Western-made warplanes. So far, President Joe Biden has resisted calls to send F-16s to Ukraine. Denmark is currently attempting to build a coalition that aims to have multiple countries transfer fighter jets to Ukraine. Washington and London have started to train Ukrainian pilots on Western warplanes. Zelensky, Murkowski, and Kelly framed the conflict in Ukraine as a war for democracy. However, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Zelensky has nationalized the media and outlawed his political opposition. Additionally, Kiev is waging a culture war against a branch of Orthodox Christians it believes are too close to Moscow. Now, I mentioned there briefly that Denmark is looking to build a coalition to send Western-made warplanes to Ukraine. This was a statement from Denmark's acting defense minister saying that Denmark will not do it alone, but we are looking at sending warplanes to Ukraine. If you look at Ukraine's current fleet of fighter jets, Connor, they have, I believe, 40 F-16s, and they're purchasing dozens of F-35s to replace those F-16s. So it would make sense if Copenhagen's plan here is to send their older fleet of warplanes to Ukraine and hoping to get the U.S. and other countries on board, so they're not the only state that is, making this escalatory step. We also have the U.S. and the U.K. training Ukrainian pilots on Western warplanes, so there may be Ukrainians trained on using those planes if they are transferred this summer. And that is, they did say that expect the decision by this summer, and Denmark is going to give about 100 Leopard 1. Those are the German-made older model battle tanks to Ukraine. Last story I had before I hand it over to Connor here. U.S. kicks off nuclear war games. The Pentagon will begin simulating a nuclear war according to the Department of Defense. The war games come as the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists warn a civilization-ending war is closer than at any time in history. The military exercises, dubbed Global Thunder 23, will be conducted by STRATCOM. American soldiers and bombers will be joined by allies in the war games. The STRATCOM press release said this year's drills will include an increased number of bomber aircraft flights throughout the exercise. Global Thunder is an annual war game. The exercises are typically conducted at the end of the year. Last year, the Pentagon delayed Global Thunder until early 2023, making this year's iteration of Global Thunder the first since Russia invaded Ukraine. During Global Thunder 22, held in November 21, U.S. strategic bombers flew within 12.4 miles of the Russian border and simulated a nuclear attack. STRATCOM maintains the war games are not in response to actions by any nation or actors. Rather, they were intended to enhance the nuclear readiness and ensure a safe, secure, and reliable strategic deterrence force. However, American and military officials said in 2019 that training missions in Europe could be used to drop bombs. It's no longer just to go partner with our NATO allies or to go over and have a visible presence of American air power, Colonel Michael Miller, 2nd Bomber Wing Commander, said. That's a part of it, but we are also there to drop weapons if called to do so. The Bulletin for Atomic Scientists has warned that a proxy war between Washington and Moscow is pushing the world towards nuclear conflict. We are living in a time of unprecedented danger, and the Doomsday Clock reflects that reality. 90 seconds to midnight is the closest the clock has ever been set to midnight, and it's a decision our experts do not take lightly. And that's what the president and CEO of BAS said in January. So with that, Connor, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you give us some updates on what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got major escalations from the Americans and the Israelis, while at the same time, there's more and more developments happening looking toward a multipolar world. And we're seeing more diplomacy being led by the Russians and the Chinese, of course, and more progress being made on that front, particularly with the Saudis, the Iranians, and the Syrians. So we're going to get to that, but you'll see it's kind of a whiplash where you see there's positive news on the one side, and then the Americans and the Israelis trying to crack down on all of that multilateralism and diplomacy and try to escalate tensions, which could end up leading to a war, which is what this first story is all about. So General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said 2 weeks ago that the American military is now going to begin directly targeting the Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' foreign branch. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on March 30th. Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley has told Congress that the U.S. should be targeting Iran's Quds Force, a branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, following a drone attack in Syria that killed an American contractor. He said, quote, "We do know that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and specifically their Quds Force, that group there is what we need to be targeting, and targeting them very harshly over time. And that's exactly what we plan on doing," Milley said, according to Al Monitor. The Pentagon claimed that the drone that hit a U.S. base in Syria last month was of Iranian origin without providing evidence. President Biden then ordered airstrikes against facilities the Pentagon said were used by groups affiliated with the IRGC, referring to Shia militias that operate in Syria. Now, according to Iranian media, however, Tehran denies that the U.S. targeted facilities aligned with Iran, and they say that the airstrikes actually hit a, quote, rural development center and a grain center. So then the Pentagon later claimed that the strikes actually targeted, quote, 2 IRGC Quds Force targets, and estimated that at least 8 militants were killed in the airstrikes, but that none of them were Iranian. There were other unconfirmed reports from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, for example, that put the death toll as high as 19. If the U.S. starts targeting Iran's Quds Force directly, as Milley is suggesting here, it could very likely spark a full-blown war with Iran. The U.S. and Iran were brought to the brink of conflict in January 2020 when the Trump administration launched a drone strike that killed top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, who was the commander of the Quds Force at the time. The U.S. occupation of eastern Syria always risks sparking a wider war, as U.S. bases are frequently coming under attack. According to the Pentagon, at least since January 2021, there have been about 80 attacks on U.S. troops in Syria. The Pentagon claims that all these attacks essentially are Iran-backed, but they never provide evidence for the assertion. And many of the Shia militias there operate independently of Tehran, and other groups in Syria would have an interest in attacking U.S. forces, including ISIS, which is an enemy of both the U.S. and Iran, that would benefit from stoking a conflict between them. And this is really dangerous, of course, for a number of reasons, but I mean, it's just really a predictable outcome of the Biden administration's policy. I mean, they ramped up maximum pressure, the Trump policy, to such an extent, never really considered returning to the JCPOA. In fact, we're going to get to a sort of interim deal that they're proposing, which I don't think is going to succeed. But they had ample opportunities, especially under the Rouhani government, to return to the deal. They could have done it as soon as he got back into office. But instead, what they did was they ramped up sanctions, and they allowed Israel to run wild with an assassination campaign and a covert war campaign throughout Iran, attacking their nuclear program and members of their military and scientists, et cetera. So this is just the fact that last year they bombed Syria relentlessly in the fall in a similar sort of incident where there's an attack on a base, and then the Americans kill a bunch of people and say that it's a big message to Iran. And the more that we're constantly attacking people in their own countries and illegally occupying this land, they're constantly making all these enemies, and Israel is bombing Syria at a much higher rate than they usually do now. And so it's going to not only put the troops in danger, but it's going to lead to, officials like Milley making very short-sighted decisions based essentially on domestic politics, because it's, for the Biden administration to be tough on Iran, that's obviously very important to them, and to be shown to be extremely supportive and deferential to Tel Aviv. So, this is an extremely precarious situation, and we definitely need to keep an eye on it. So in line with that, I believe on the same day that report came out, we had Israel bomb Damascus again, only this time they killed 2 IRGC officers. So this is from Dave DeCamp on April 2nd. Israeli airstrikes in Syria killed 2 Iranian IRGC members. So 2 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed in Israeli airstrikes that targeted Damascus on Friday, March 31st. That day, the IRGC announced that a military officer and advisor named Milad Haidari was killed in the Israeli attacks. And 2 days later, on Sunday, they announced that another IRGC officer, Meqtad Mekghani, Jafar Abadi, succumbed to his wounds. And according to Middle East Eye, the IRGC said in a statement that Jafar Abadi, a member of the Revolutionary Guards, was wounded in a criminal attack of the Zionist regime on Friday and was martyred due to the severity of his injuries. The IRGC then vowed revenge for their officers. They said the crimes of the Zionist regime will not go unanswered, and they will pay for this. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani also said that Tehran intends to respond. Now, the Israeli killings of the IRGC members came after the U.S. military said that it planned to target the Quds Force. And Israel is, of course, vastly escalating their strikes in Syria. They targeted Homs, the central province of Syria, later on Sunday, the following Sunday. And Syria reported that at least 5 Syrian soldiers were wounded in that attack. And the incident marks the third Israeli airstrike in Syria over just 4 days, an escalation that comes as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, faces his political crisis at home over his planned judicial overhaul. And early in March, Israel bombed Syria's Aleppo airport twice, putting it temporarily out of service. Aleppo was devastated by the earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey. Thousands of Syrians were killed. This earthquake hit on February 6th, and the Israeli airstrikes cut off 8 flights into the city. This next story we have is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on March 30th. The World Court rules U.S. illegally froze some Iranian assets. So the UN's top court has ruled that the U.S. violated international law by freezing assets owned by Iranian companies. The International Court of Justice ordered Washington to pay compensation to Tehran, but the amount is yet to be determined, and the court has no way of enforcing its rulings. Iran brought the case to the International Court of Justice, seeking to unlock $1.75 billion in frozen central bank funds. However, the court ruled that the central bank funds were outside of its jurisdiction. Iran's foreign ministry said in a statement that the verdict shows once again the legitimacy of Iran's positions and the illegal behavior of the United States. But since the court said it did not have jurisdiction over the frozen funds, the U.S. also took the ruling as a victory, saying this was the acting legal advisor for the State Department, Rich Vizek, saying this is a major victory for the United States and victims of Iran's state-sponsored terrorism. He said the vast majority of Iran's case was related to frozen central bank funds. Iran brought the case to the ICJ in 2016 and said that by freezing assets to compensate victims of terror attacks, Washington claims were linked to Tehran. The U.S. has violated a 1955 Treaty of Friendship known as the Treaty of Amity, which was signed following the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran. The Trump administration withdrew from the Treaty of Amity in 2018, but the court said the U.S. still violated the agreement because it was a party to the treaty when the funds were frozen. Quote, the court has concluded the United States violated its obligations under the Treaty of Amity, an ICJ judge said. The court has ruled that the central bank funds were outside of its jurisdiction because only commercial enterprises were protected by the treaty. Okay, and this next story is about Saudi Arabia inviting Assad back into the Arab League, and there's an upcoming summit in May. So this is from Dave DeCamp on April 2nd. Saudi Arabia is planning to invite Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to an Arab League summit Riyadh is hosting in May, Reuters reported, citing 3 people familiar with the plan. The move would be a significant step in the normalization of Syria's relations with regional countries. Damascus was suspended from the Arab League in 2011, and many of the bloc's members supported the failed regime change effort against Assad, including Saudi Arabia. The news comes after Syria's foreign minister visited Egypt for the first time in over a decade. An Egyptian security source told Reuters that the purpose of the visit was to work towards Syria rejoining the Arab League, which is based in Cairo. And this is being done via Saudi and Egyptian mediation. And Syria and Saudi Arabia have been holding talks on reestablishing ties, and they're expected to soon resume formal diplomatic relations and reopen their embassies as well. And their ties have been suspended, their diplomatic relations have been suspended since 2011. So this is a huge deal. And the U.S. is opposed to the regional countries normalizing with Syria as it prefers to keep the country isolated and under crippling economic sanctions. Washington also occupies about a third of Syrian territory, where most of the country's oil and wheat resources are located. So much of this recent engagement between regional countries in Syria comes after the devastating earthquake that killed thousands in northwest Syria. And following the quake, the State Department said that it still opposes other countries upgrading ties with Assad, even if it's part of an effort to help out with the earthquake relief. So here's that report. This next one is about the interim deal that I was discussing earlier. That's not a return to the JCPOA, but it's one of these freeze for freeze kind of ideas that we've talked about before. But this is we talked a couple of weeks ago about these ongoing talks that Middle East Eye said were going on through back channels, through that the Raisi government, that his administration was not necessarily a part of, that these were diplomats, some figures from the Rouhani government, the previous government, who were answering to the Ayatollah, and that they were carrying out these back channel talks. Although I'm not sure, this sounds more like kind of an American idea, but who knows? So this is from Dave DeCamp on April 3rd. Now they're saying that the Biden administration has spoken with European allies and Israel about this potential interim deal where Iran that would give the Islamic Republic limited sanctions relief in exchange for a freeze on some aspects of its civilian nuclear program. And this comes from Axios earlier this month. And the report cites unnamed Israeli officials and Western diplomats who said that the idea is to get Iran to stop enriching uranium at 60% in exchange for some sanctions relief. And the 60% enrichment is the highest level Iran has ever achieved, but it's still well below the 90% needed for weapons-grade uranium. The Pentagon acknowledged this in its nuclear posture review, its recent nuclear posture review, when they said that Iran is not attempting to build a nuclear weapon. And Axios previously reported that Israel told the Biden administration that Iran enriching over 60% could trigger an Israeli attack, but Israeli pressure and threats are exactly why Iran is enriching to 60% to begin with, as Tehran took that step in response to an Israeli covert attack on the Natanz nuclear facility in April 2021, when the indirect negotiations in Vienna began under the Biden administration to try and bring the Americans back into the JCPOA. So an unmistakable message there. And before that, Iran began enriching uranium tetrafluoride to 20%. Over the Israeli assassination working with the Mujahideen Khalq, where they killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was a Iranian scientist, in November of 2020. Now, sources told Axios that the Biden administration began discussing the possible freeze-for-freeze approach in January and then briefed Britain, France, Germany, and Israel on the idea in February. I guess they're not talking to the Russians and the Chinese. But the report said Iran was aware of the proposal, and they've so far rejected it. And it's not clear if there's been any real negotiations or offers yet. And in recent months, of course, the Biden administration has rejected diplomacy with Iran and increased sanctions on the country. And U.S. officials have repeatedly said that attempting to return to the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA is not a priority. And in fact, President Biden in November during a campaign event declared that the agreement was dead, but that he couldn't say that publicly because it's, quote, a long story. U.S. and Israeli officials have also stepped up their threats against Iran, and tensions are soaring. All right, more bombings of Syria from the Israelis. This is from April 3rd. Again, from antiwar.com by Dave. 2 civilians killed in latest Israeli airstrikes in Syria. So Israel continues its relentless bombing campaign in Syria during the early morning hours of last Tuesday, the 4th, launching airstrikes targeting the southern suburbs of Damascus and killing 2 civilians, Syria's Sana news agency reported. Now, the pro-opposition UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights also reported that 2 civilians were killed in the Israeli bombardment. And the SOHR described the target that was hit as a glass laboratory and said the strikes also targeted the Damascus International Airport and, quote, Iranian positions. Sana said that some of the missiles Israel fired were intercepted by Syrian air defenses. The report said that the strikes were launched at 12:15 a.m. local time in Syria. And this comes, of course, as Netanyahu is facing a major political crisis over his planned judicial overhaul. And due to the pressure, he's paused the overhaul, but there's still massive protests in Israel. And correspondingly, Netanyahu has been bombing Gaza, and also bombing Lebanon and bombing Syria, of course. And there's been major attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem as well. Iran says that this is the next story from Dave again. Iran says that it foiled a drone attack in the Iranian city of Isfahan. And again, Tel Aviv is suspected. So Iranian authorities have said that they foiled a drone attack on a military facility in the Iranian city of Isfahan. According to Iran's press TV, the Iranian Defense Ministry said that one of its facilities in the city had come under attack by a micro aerial vehicle, which was shot down by air defenses. The ministry said the attack didn't cause any casualties or damage to the facility. Israel is the number one suspect of being behind the attack, as they have a history of launching covert operations, particularly with drones, especially during the last year. Inside Iran. And in January, there were three small drones that targeted another facility in Isfahan, and both Iranian and U.S. officials said that Israel was responsible. So, and Israel, of course, has previously targeted nuclear facilities and murdered scientists and military officers in these covert attacks that they carry out routinely in Iran, as we mentioned previously. All right. Now Israel is saying that they're ready to attack Iran without U.S. help. The IDF chief says it's not an obligation for the Americans to conduct bilateral operations. Although, according to some of these leaked documents, that's exactly what Israel is asking for. At least it sounds like they want to do joint operations against Iran in Syria. So this is from the April 6th. From DavidAntiWar.com, the head of the IDF said Wednesday, Israel is, quote, ready to attack Iran and can do so without help from the U.S. That seems fanciful, but he says we are ready to act against Iran. The Israeli army has the ability to strike both in distant countries and near home. This is the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, speaking. The comments come, of course, with tensions skyrocketing. Israel has a history of launching covert attacks inside Iran. It's not clear if they have the warplanes to pull off an attack on Iran. They lack the refueling planes. They also lack the bunker buster bombs that they need to carry out an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities that are built deep underground, just because Israel has these exact kind of plans, and because they've conducted other attacks for years on their nuclear program. And they also lack planes that are capable of carrying the bunker buster bombs. Although I believe that there are some Pentagon contracts they're expected to get some of this equipment in the coming years. Under these deals were signed under the Biden administration, or approved under the Biden administration, I believe in 2021. But it's very unlikely that they have the ability to do this, let alone the fact that they would have to stop off for refueling in many of these Arab regional countries in the area that are currently normalizing with Iran, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, or Israel or Syria. And so this is just, for a lot of reasons, just seems like more posturing. But he insists that they're able to do it. And of course, we know that they have been preparing to attack Iran for years. He says, we know how to act alone. We are a sovereign nation that reserves the right to make its own decisions. It would be good to have the United States on our side, but it is not an obligation. Well, I think we can all be thankful for that. The U.S. and Israel have been rehearsing for war with Iran by holding massive military exercises. In January, the U.S. and Israel held their largest ever joint drills in a provocative message aimed at Tehran. Tensions continue to rise, and there's just some more stuff here about the crackdown on the Palestinians, of course, and the brutal attacks at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, and of course the bombings of Gaza and Lebanon. And some rockets were fired from southern Lebanon, reportedly by Palestinian factions, not by Hezbollah. And so Israel responded by bombing Gaza several times. This was last week, and then they started to also conduct some strikes in southern Lebanon as well. Okay, now this next piece, again, more rocket attacks on illegal U.S. outposts in Syria. So we have a rocket attack that's targeting U.S. base at Conoco gas field in Syria. This is from April 10th. A base in Syria that houses U.S. troops is targeted in a rocket attack on Monday, according to the AP. The U.S. military said there were no casualties or damage in the attacks, in the attack, which targeted mission support site Conoco, which is located on the Conoco gas fields in Syria's Deir ez-Zor province in the eastern part of the country. As part of its occupation of Syria, the U.S. controls oil fields just like this and much of Syria's gas resources. And the U.S. bases in Syria frequently come under attack, and the continued occupation always risks sparking this larger war. And we know that the ostensible purpose of the American occupation of Syria, they always say it's to fight ISIS. And that's why we're staying and not going anywhere, no matter what. But of course, this is all about the economic war against Damascus, stealing, as we said, their land, stealing their energy resources, and keeping them crushed under the Caesar Act sanctions, which deliberately target their construction and engineering sectors, ensuring that they can never rebuild after this horrible, dirty war where the U.S. committed treason, backing al-Qaeda, militants against Damascus and their affiliates. And it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country, which is why these developments are so positive with these, it being brought in from the cold in the region. But of course, this is not on the agenda for the Americans. So, I suspect that they will go a lot further to stop this. So after the recent escalations, the White House said they have absolutely no plans to leave Syria despite the risks involved. The U.S. currently has about 900 troops deployed in the country, backing the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in the region. And on top of the occupation, the U.S. maintains, as I say, these sanctions. Okay, now we have Bill Burns, the CIA director, going to Saudi Arabia and complaining about these normalization deals with Iran and Syria to the Saudis. So this is from April 6th. CIA Director William Burns visited Saudi Arabia last week and expressed frustration over Riyadh's surprise normalization deal with Tehran brokered by Beijing. This is from a Wall Street Journal report last week. And according to the journal, Burns told Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that the U.S. has felt blindsided by Riyadh's rapprochement with Iran, as well as Syria, two nations who the U.S. is crushing with sanctions. And following the deal with Iran, Saudi Arabia is poised to normalize with Syria. Riyadh is expected to invite Bashar al-Assad to the Arab League summit in May. The Biden administration is vehemently against this, and they've made very clear that the policy has not changed, and they're against any upgrading of ties with Syria. A U.S. official told Reuters that Burns also discussed intelligence cooperation with Riyadh, saying the director reinforced our commitment to intelligence cooperation, especially in the areas of counterterrorism. And also on Thursday, Saudi Arabia and Iran's foreign ministers met in Beijing, marking the highest level meeting between the two countries since they severed diplomatic ties in 2016. And at that meeting, they agreed to reopen their embassies and work toward other forms of cooperation. At the press briefing, China's foreign ministry spokesman Mao Ning said that Beijing was ready to continue mediating between the two sides. Quote, "We are ready to keep playing a mediating role, support both sides in building trust, dispelling misgivings, and realizing good neighborliness, and contribute China's wisdom and strength to promoting security, stability, and development in the Middle East." Oh, and excuse me, this is Mao Ning is a lady, so that's what she said. Okay. Now, the next story here, Moscow hosts a meeting aimed at Syria, a normalization between Ankara and Damascus. So this is from April 4th from antiwar.com by Dave DeCamp again. The deputy foreign ministers of Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Russia have wrapped up 2 days of talks in Moscow on Tuesday that were aimed at working toward a normalization deal between Turkey and Syria. There's no sign that any breakthroughs were made, although a follow-up meeting at the foreign minister level is expected to happen soon. A Turkish foreign ministry source told Russia's TASS news agency that the four sides agreed to continue consultations, and they're planning to hold this next meeting, obviously at a higher level, at the foreign minister's level. And Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow has proposed dates for the meeting. The talks this week built on a meeting between Syria and Turkey's defense ministers, which was hosted by Russia last December, marking the first time the two countries held talks at that level since 2011. And Damascus has made clear that any normalization deal with Ankara hinges on a Turkish withdrawal from the territory it occupies in northern Syria. And a rapprochement between Syria and Turkey would be a major breakthrough, as Ankara, much like Saudi Arabia, supported the failed regime change effort against Assad, and they still back anti-government fighters on the ground. So now the U.S., again, we see this sort of whiplash here. So then the next story is the U.S. deploys guided missile submarine to the Middle East amid Iran tensions. This is from antiwar.com on the 13th. The U.S. Navy has deployed a guided missile submarine capable of carrying up to 154 Tomahawk missiles to the Middle East in a show of force amid heightened tensions with Iran. Commander Timothy Hawkins, a spokesman for the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, announced the deployment on Saturday. He said it is capable of carrying up to 154 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and it's deployed to the U.S. Fifth Fleet to help ensure regional maritime security and stability. The announcement is likely meant as a message to Tehran, as the U.S. rarely reveals the location of its submarines. The Fifth Fleet often sends vessels near Iran's coast through the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. has previously deployed bombers on round-trip flights to the Middle East whenever tensions are raised with Iran. The submarine deployment comes after Mark Milley said that the military was going to begin targeting the Quds Force, and they're also saying, I guess, Western officials are claiming to the New York Times that there's a risk that the IRGC may launch a drone attack against an Israeli-owned merchant vessel in the region. But there doesn't appear to be any evidence for that yet. So Hawkins mentioned alleged threats from Iran when announcing the submarine deployment. Recent events, including the strikes in Syria and public threats made by Iran against merchant vessels, prompted us to remind regional mariners to remain vigilant, he said. Okay. Now, Saudi Arabia is hosting a meeting on they're getting ready to host this meeting on Friday that's focusing on bringing Syria back into the Arab League. So this is from the 11th. Saudi Arabia will host a meeting this Friday of Arab foreign ministers to discuss bringing Damascus back into the Arab League, which suspended Syria in 2011. This is from Reuters. The Qatari foreign ministry spokesman, Majed al-Ansari, said that the meeting will be attended by the foreign ministers of Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Al-Ansari said the main aim is to discuss the situation in Syria. There are many developments regarding the situation in Syria and points of view of Arab states about the return of Syria to the Arab League. Saudi Arabia is expected to invite Bashar al-Assad to attend that May 19th Arab League summit, which is going to be held in Riyadh. The move is significant we've been through this already, but the Wall Street Journal reported, and we covered this back in March, that there was a plan that Arab countries were looking for a way to put together a normalization deal with Assad that would involve Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other U.S. allies lobbying for an end to Western sanctions on Syria, which would be one of the absolutely best outcomes out of all of this. Okay, so last story here from April 12th. Syrian foreign minister arrives in Saudi Arabia for the first time since 2011. So Faisal Mekdad, Syria's foreign minister, arrived in Saudi Arabia this Wednesday as Riyadh and Damascus continue to push toward normalization. Mekdad's trip marks the first time a Syrian foreign minister has visited Saudi since 2011, when, of course, they cut ties. When Riyadh cut ties and then supported the CIA's dirty war against Damascus. Now, the Saudi Foreign Ministry said that Mekdad and Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan will hold a session of talks on efforts to reach a political solution to the Syrian crisis that preserves Syria's unity, security, and stability. And the visit comes amid reports that Saudi is working to restore Syria's membership in the Arab League. Riyadh and Damascus are expected to reopen embassies soon. So it's very interesting to see all these the parallel developments in the region, where you see the Russians coming in and helping to try and to mend ties between Turkey and Syria, and hopefully get the Turkish occupation to end the Turkish occupation, which is obviously a red line for Syria. We see the Chinese coming in and doing what is essentially unthinkable, putting a normalization deal together between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now there's going to be all kinds of business going back and forth. The Saudis are talking about all the investments they're going to make into the Iranian economy, which is, of course, much needed after all these years of the economic siege. And the fact that Assad is being brought back into the Arab League, they just realize that he's not going anywhere, and that it's much better to have, just sort of work out your differences and to have economic partners rather than being permanently, enmeshed in these Cold War style blocks that the U.S. is trying to build seemingly everywhere. But for a long time in the Middle East, they've used this divide and conquer strategy, and it's great to see that they're just not tolerating it anymore, and that it's much better for someone, for a country like China to come in who's more interested in economic development, and business partners who can just put together deals like this that are win-win. And so that'll be great. But unfortunately, as we're seeing, the Americans and the Israelis are driving us toward conflict again. And I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of, who knows what Netanyahu will do, but we'll definitely keep an eye on it. It looks like they're really going to start hitting Syria a lot harder.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that update on the happenings in the Middle East. We'll be back with more shows next week. Everybody, if you could subscribe to our Twitter handle at con_interest, you'll catch all the shows as well as any articles that myself or Connor writes. Connor, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.